of the day, so congrats on making it this far. It's not too far away from drinks, so I appreciate your coming and hearing this rather, I think, excellent conversation we have about carbon capture and storage, and the wonderful joy that neither the government nor Labour will be here, so you'll be here to have some meaty policy discussions and no various half-truths or obfuscations, one hopes. And you know, as we understand, carbon capture is a significant part of our energy agenda. We're looking at a 20 to 30 million tonnes per year saving potentially in carbon emissions by 2030, and an annual basis at 50 million tonnes by 2035, which makes it a very appealing prospect. And as we've seen, there's a £20 billion spending commitment from the government on carbon capture. So I'm here to talk about this potential opportunity with my colleagues here, with Ros Bullied from Green Alliance and David Cairns from Equinor. I think the best place to start actually probably is with the money, in fact, with the £20 billion commitment that's been made. One of the few things the government actually hasn't rowed back on in the last few months when it comes to green energy agenda. Do you think this is the best allocation of resources, David? And do you feel as though this will be enough to tempt the industry into doing major projects?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks very much to Politico for letting us be partners with this event. It's been a really fascinating afternoon. So, I mean, Equinor's role in carbon capture storage, just to share it, is so we do carbon capture storage in Norway and have done since 1996. Also in Norway, we're developing the first cross-border storage of carbon capture called Northern Lights. That's taking CO2 from elsewhere in Europe and storing it in Norway. And then thirdly, we are investing in the UK to do carbon capture and storage in the UK. So we believe it's part of the solution. If you look at the sort of headlines for our Northern Lights project, it's an industrial solution to an industrial problem, and we agree with that. And then to your question on the money, so £20 billion for the UK to invest in this is a lot of money. And we know just how hard the DESNEs and the Treasury teams are working on this. They've done really, really fantastic work. And it sounds a lot. So I think the question then, when we see Treasury, this happens all the time. What is the best place to spend each pound? And I think where the UK is on this is on the early stages. So the government is saying, we're going to invest in this now, but we expect it as quickly as possible to become commercial and to wash its own face. That's what's happened essentially on offshore wind, and that's what they hope to happen on this. So and we're part of that.
Are there any hurdles between yourselves committing to carbon capture projects and for the whole construction development period between you and the government? Is there any policy changes you think need to be addressed or made, or are you pretty happy with where things are?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the challenges for the government, it is creating a new industry in the UK, and that's not easy. And the UK has tried this more than once. For those who've been involved for a long time, an earlier project was closed in 2014, 2015 by the government because of cash. And this year is crucial. So this September, essentially, that the government and the companies such as us and BP and others who are involved in it will take our decisions to invest or not. And so I think everyone is hoping to get these first projects away, because that then starts it. It gives confidence to the industry that it'll carry on. If we collectively fail, that is going to be difficult for the UK for the next few years.
What were Equinor's full-year profits last year?
Equinor's full-year, internationally, were large. I don't have the number to my head, but just to say on profits. So we are a large company involved in oil and gas, and we make profits on that. We make profits on our renewable industries. We're also the second largest tax-paying company in the world. Yeah. So we pay our dues into society as well.
Sure. I mean, you do make a lot of money too. That's why you pay a lot of taxes, to be fair.
Yeah, it's true. And that's it's I tried to say that, but Norway has had a tax regime of 78% on oil and gas since the 1970s. It also has a regime that encourages investment in it since the 1970s. And the product of that, and saving that money, is a sovereign wealth fund worth $1.4 trillion.
When we talk about vast sums of money, Ross, do you think there might be better uses for the £20 billion when it comes to carbon capture? And do you think perhaps that we should be selective about what processes we use for carbon capture or not?
Yes, I mean, it's really great to see 20 billion being committed for something that is to be welcomed. 20 billion put towards energy efficiency in homes, or something, some of those other hard-to-solve issues would be equally welcome. And I would also say that if the industry thinks, the oil and gas industry thinks that CCS is the solution, could it have started a bit sooner itself and using its own money? Very, very keen to see the government move to that kind of point of a market-based approach. And ideally, that would be a polluter pays principle as well from our point of view. I mean, something like the carbon take-back obligations that have been raised where there would be an expectation the industry invests in return for, as a proportion of its activity, seems to us very appealing, because I think there is a question as to why this is the particular sector that has been targeted for support. I also think actually that the longer we wait for that investment, and it's government and industry, but the longer we wait, the more actually alternative solutions are being found. So we don't have any coal-fired power plants anymore to fit CCS2, which was the original intention with these CCS. We also don't have any fertilizer industry, which was another sector that we were going to apply CCS to. And the steel plants, where CCS was seen as really a viable solution a few years ago, and now looking at recycling with electric arc furnaces and potentially using green hydrogen to make green iron, maybe not in the UK so much, but globally. So I think there is a question about the uses, as you were saying, Nick, that they're shrinking over time, and actually that's really important. I think there are some uses that we do think there are viable reasons in certain sectors for CCS, but we would be concerned about a really blanket approach. And I think if there is going to be a lot of public money going to the sector, we need to be really careful about where that is being applied and from which uses.
Sure, I understand the point around like sort of being fiscally prudent. I guess one question around CCS though is that it would be seen as a way of being able to continue and ensure employment across the North Sea oil and gas sector, which is also a hugely important industry in the UK, and the risks that deindustrialisation faces. We've seen Keir Starmer talk about this. We've seen under pressure from the unions about this, for example. Is there a risk that think tanks aren't sensitive enough to the realities of the employment of the North Sea oil and gas sector, and the need for sort of ensuring a plan out of industrialisation? And can carbon capture and storage perhaps be part of that?
The oil and gas sector has the levers, it certainly has the skills and expertise, but I think it should be applying those itself to addressing the problem. I don't think it necessarily needs the government support in order to do that. And we absolutely need a plan to transition out of fossil fuels. I'm very sympathetic to the need to find alternative jobs for workers. I think what I'm concerned about is that we keep linking carbon capture and storage and continued oil and gas extraction. That we heard Rishi Sunak do that last summer really clearly. Very happy to see CCS and definitely think there are valid sectors in which should be used, but at the same time, we're really clear that fossil fuel extraction has to be phased out.
Just coming on the role it plays. So I think one of the the good approaches the UK has taken on this is to focus CCUS on these big industrial clusters. So the Humber, Teesside and Liverpool, where you've got a whole range of really highly emitting companies needing a solution for those emissions. And Ros is quite right. Over time, there are different solutions for different companies. So sometimes that can mean closing, which is not good locally. Sometimes they're going to be moving your operations elsewhere. Sometimes it might be new technologies that means it's not necessary. But if I take, for example, a Dutch company called Yara, who is our first customer for the Northern Lights, they'll be sending 800,000 tons of CO2 a year to Norway to allow their ammonia production facility in the Netherlands to carry on and be zero emissions. That's a good bit of industry that the Dutch want to keep going.
Absolutely, but I think of the clusters and the projects going ahead, there's actually only one cement plant that I understand it, of the projects going forwards in the clusters. There's quite a few people looking to do blue hydrogen, which I don't think is the kind of, should be a long-term solution. And there's also things like sustainable aviation fuels, which we know are not the best approach in the long term to tackling aviation. So when it's on things like cement plants, yeah, or when it's used for direct air capture, absolutely really see the potential benefits short-term and long-term, but I think some of those other uses we'd be a little bit more worried about.
So we've heard there's a bit of disagreement here about whether the Track 1 and Track 2 selections were the right ones.
Well, in the Track 1, we put forward a lot of different projects. So in the Humber Saltend cluster, we've got the whole Saltend facility, which has got chemicals, ammonia, et cetera, and they haven't been chosen so far. We hope they will be in due course, but that the government has chosen which projects to proceed with at this stage, and so we respect that.
Sure. One key area for this, I guess, is also the sense of continuity, because obviously we have an election probably coming this year, and although it's a shame that Labour weren't here for this panel, I was wondering if you were looking for any sort of certainty around Labour's approach to CCS, because obviously if the polls are accurate, we could have a different regime different party in charge of the Westminster. I didn't call Ed Miliband the regime leader, sorry. Yeah, so is there any need for certainty around Labour's approach to CCS? Because we haven't really heard much from them about, well, basically any energy policy for about 2 years now. But on the issue of CCS, what's your thoughts on that, Ross?
I mean, I guess I would be a little torn here because I've just said that there's better uses of spending 20 billion, but I'm very much committed to the long-term policy certainty. So I think what I would want to see is them also rapidly moving towards that kind of market-based solution in which the costs don't fall on the taxpayers for support. I would agree that we don't know very much about Labour's policy in areas like this. I imagine they'd be looking for consistency as well, but I don't know.
I mean, I think what I've heard them say is actually pretty supportive of the industry. We know they want to develop the cluster in Scotland, in Acorn, for example. I think should they come into power, they will have the same question you posed at the beginning, which is what is the best way to spend each pound to try and get the energy transition as fast as possible?
Sure, and from your conversations, what do you think Labour's answer is to that question? David?
So we had the discussion earlier on about the 2030 target and so on. All of these targets are huge, and none of them are likely to be met as put. But actually, what they are doing, as other panels have said, is it's driving things faster than would otherwise have happened, and that's great.
Sure. So when it comes to like the projects that you're looking at, for example, the one in Track 2 and Teesside that you're part of, you don't see any friction if, for example, Labour were to take power in the next sort of 6 to 8 months. That wouldn't have any sort of continuity problems for you in processing your CCS projects.
I don't think so. So, for example, earlier this spring, that the government announced that the UK would need new gas plants as a sort of temporary supply, and Labour didn't argue with that at the time. I think everyone's, the last 25 years, roughly, the UK has been pretty consistent in its energy transition policies to be ambitious on it and to move as fast as it can. So, future gas is going to be only if it's abated through CCS and nothing else.
Sure. When it comes to CCS, although it's like an established technology, it's still a fairly nascent industry in terms of like where it is right now relative to the scale you're trying to build it to. So I guess the question is, for example, it's been 32 years since we actually built a reservoir in this country, 29 since nuclear, about 9 since any meaningful onshore wind developments. What makes you confident that you can basically build up an industry from, well, not scratch, but from a very low base in time to meet an agenda over the next decade? I'll go with David first.
Okay. So just some of the numbers and the scales. So from our storage that we do in Norway, each well that you drill allows you to store about 1.5 million tons of CO2 a year. So to meet that 2030 target you mentioned earlier, that means the industry will have to drilled between 10 and 20 wells by 2030. Is that likely? Probably not, but will there be some? Yes, I'm certain they can. And then back to the earlier point of discussion, which is the UK is trying to create this industry. So what the UK has is this fantastic bequest of the North Sea. If you're living in Germany, which is Europe's largest industrial country, you don't have a place to store your CO2. But actually, the North Sea can be part of that solution to that problem, which is why you see discussions between Norway and Germany, between the UK and elsewhere, as for a future that actually, essentially, UK and Norway together can help solve that problem.
There are significant differences in UK and Norway. For example, you mentioned the sovereign wealth fund, but there's also the reality the UK has an aging, kind of creaking basin now that's going to be declining significantly. Norway's a bit earlier on in its journey towards maturing, I'd say. Do you see it as being an issue, having some sort of UK-Norway combined policy, being a Norwegian energy giant?
No, because I think what we have is the same geology. So those oil and gas basins, which are coming to the end of their life, provide the geology for us to store CO2. So if over time there is an effective, efficient, economic way to make this part of Europe's energy transition, then that's great, surely.
What are your thoughts on this, Ross?
Yes, I mean, there have definitely been challenges in quite a few of the CCS projects around the world. The ones in Norway are success stories, relatively speaking, but there have definitely been projects that haven't gone so well. So I think one thing is really important is just to get on and test whether it works in the UK context, actually. I think if it doesn't, and given how much CCS is in the UK's plans as well, then we really need to find some alternative solutions. So actually, I'm very supportive of us getting on and doing it as quickly as we can to see if it's a viable solution. If it's not, then we need to really seriously think about diet change and not flying and some of these things that are just politically quite challenging. So, yeah, I think it's important to find out whether that works. I also think potentially there's some risks around suggesting it will always work. I'm slightly worried that the kind of expectations, if we get one or more projects not working, how that conversation is going to go as well. So I think there's a kind of question around the comms. But yeah, certainly I think it's good to be aware of the fact that this hasn't always been a straightforward technology and capture rates can't always be as high as hoped.
Yeah, do you think there's any risk of that at all, of the projects actually that, like, for someone in the track 1 process, only on track 2, but in track 1, if projects don't actually have the potential that you think they have, I mean, Equinor will have to pivot, right?
Yeah, I think the reality of any project is, as Ross said, we want to get on and see if it works. We think it will. We think we've done our due diligence to make it work, but you don't know until you start. So we will, and that's why the government has, it hasn't approved all the projects thus far. It's given a lot of money, but it's only given money for a certain amount to see if it works, see if it's affordable, and see if it can be replicated.
Yeah. If you were Preston, would you rather £20 billion was spent on CCS or energy efficiency?
I mean, it's definitely better to reduce energy use at source, so I would go for the energy efficiency. Ideally, we'd have larger budgets generally and not have to pick and choose between our various children. But I think it's critical that we actually, and CCS should be a last resort, really. We need to make sure that we're reducing energy at source. We need to make sure that we're consuming less and doing everything we can, that we shouldn't be kind of resorting to these end-of-pipe solutions.
Yeah, the reason I touch on this is you've kind of prompted it, which is there a risk that CCS actually takes us away from the real question, which actually is about how much we have to reduce our energy usage in order to actually meet net zero, and the behavioural changes maybe that might be politically inconvenient to talk about actually being more important than continuing oil and gas production or CCS as a mitigation measure? What do you think on that, David?
So I think the idea that energy usage is going to decline is unrealistic at a global level, because energy usage at a global level is going to increase. As countries like India get richer, they want to have the same standard of life as everybody in this room, and so at a global level it's going up. The issue is about how to make sure that without those high standards of life, it's not polluting the planet as much as we are today. So it's about new technologies providing that great prosperity, but also at less carbon footprint.
Does Equinor have a pathway for reducing oil and gas usage generally alongside its CCS aspirations?
Yeah, so basically we see ourselves as an energy company. 20 years ago we just did oil and we just did gas. Today we do oil and gas and solar and wind and floating wind and batteries. And in 20 years' time, we'll do more different stuff as well. And I think what our position, and this includes investing in the UK, is for long as you need oil and gas in the system, we think we can produce that in as a sort of environmentally best way you possibly can, at the same time growing as fast as you can your renewables.
Sure, and on that fast-growing renewables, what's the current breakup of fossil fuels and renewables at Equinor in terms of spending and profit?
It's by far oil and gas,
yeah.
But if I look at the UK context, our investment in the UK is for every pound roughly we invest in oil and gas, we're doing about 2 in the others.
Sure, do you have any set specific targets on phasing out the oil and gas itself over
no, decades? We don't have a target to phase it out.
Okay.
Because as I say, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the big panic was, are the lights going to go off? Not so much in the UK, because UK's security is okay, but if you were in Germany, where all of your gas came from Russia, they were really worried, and actually they turned to Norway to help them out. We as an energy transition group here, if in 5 years' time or 10 years' time, suddenly the lights are going out in the UK because we've made a mistake, our population will absolutely crucify for this, and they'll be right to do so.
Sure. Sorry.
I mean, but if you look at something like Rosebank, it is the majority of it is oil, and it's going to be exported, though.
Yeah, it is, and it's going to be exported to Europe. So, we produce a lot in Norway, and all of our gas and all of our oil today goes to Europe after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think often people criticize saying, well, it's not about UK security. I think that downplays the UK's role in Europe's energy security. So if our investment in Rosebank can help Germany keep its lights on, that's a good thing.
When it comes to the question of Rosebank itself, though, I mean, they talk about the very low emission levels for it. But if you actually involve the refining process after extraction, the numbers are much more tight than compared to, well, and when it comes to gas, it's actually much of a muchness. So.
Yeah, I don't think that's quite right. So, obviously the biggest emissions from oil and gas is when you burn it to use it. But the energy you use to produce it is significant. So if I take an example from Norway, we have a field called Johan Sverdrup. It's an oil field, and it produces 700,000 barrels every day, which is it's huge. It's powered by hydropower from shore. So most oil and gas takes about 20 kilograms of CO2 per barrel to get out of the ground. Johan Sverdrup takes 1 kilogram of CO2. So in 700,000 barrels a day, 19 kilograms per barrel less of CO2, that's quite a lot of CO2 saved. It doesn't, of course, deal with the burning it at the end, but all of our industries are trying to reduce the emissions in all of our processes.
Sure.
And so that also goes for Rosebank. So our ambition for Rosebank will be to electrify it if we possibly can, and that will bring that emissions from about 13 kilograms per barrel to about 3 if we get there.
Sure. I mean, would you be prepared to commit to the electrification of the platform rigs at Equinor? I mean, for the Rosebank project?
So we've said that's our plan. So we are investing today. So the production ship, which is being fitted out in Dubai, we're spending about $150 million so that it's electrification ready from day one.
Yeah, because I guess when it comes to CCS, there's a real sort of emphasis and need for sort of trust to basically, do you take people sincerely when they talk about mitigating their carbon use, carbon emissions rather, and I guess that there'd be quite a big signifier when it comes to CCS, whether it's sincere, if we see with Rosebank actually that there is reneging on, for example, the electrification of platform rigs, which I know at the time the NSTA wrote letters to all the providers, producers, wanting to insist that actually does happen. And obviously they have their own North Sea targets as well. So would you accept that's quite a big bellwether for whether we should actually trust Equinor with net zero, how much it actually commits to what it says it's going to do with Rosebank?
Yeah, so I think if you look at what we've done in Norway, we can, we're a company that's quite proud of our record. Do we have more to do? Of course we do. Do we need to accelerate transition? Yes, of course we do. So, but our investments in the UK are in good faith, following that Norwegian model. And we're not just doing oil and gas. We're with SSE building Dogger Bank, world's biggest wind farm in the UK. That's a $10 billion investment.
Sure. Do you have any thoughts on further thoughts on Rosebank? Do you want to outline?
I suppose that one of the things from my point of view as well is that the government's subsidies and through tax breaks for fossil fuel projects, which just seems, again, it's another question of is that where you want to spend the money? And particularly in the case of Equinor, where, essentially that goes to Norway's sovereign wealth fund, or a share of it potentially goes to Norway's sovereign wealth fund. So I would, there's the bigger moral question. Someone needs to stop producing oil and gas somewhere, and maybe the UK and Norway would be the sort of countries that are able to make those decisions. But I think also, at the very least, we should be careful about where we spend subsidies.
Sure. When it comes to Equinor and their renewable projects, as well as CCS, that's part of the whole mitigation we're talking about. You obviously have offshore wind and talk about Dogger Bank, but when we spoke with offshore wind for Equinor, they raised concerns that the pot wasn't big enough for the allocation rounds. Is there a case that companies are being a bit greedy to be demanding a bigger pot for renewables and then also a big pot for CCS? If you look at the CapEx, I kind of made this point earlier at the beginning, but just sort of to reiterate it, if you look at the CapEx and you look at the profits that Equinor has made over the last 2 to 3 years, surely if there was a business case for these things, you would have pushed them already.
Yeah, so you had discussion before about offshore wind. So the UK, as we discussed, has a really good track record on developing offshore wind. The last auction round that got no bidders, the UK government could have taken a position which was, unless it's cheaper than last time, we're not doing anything at all, because there is a sort of assumption around the industry that it's always going to be cheaper. But the lesson of the past couple of years is, inflation does have an impact. So I think the government has done a brave thing, which is say, okay, for next round, it will be more expensive electricity, but it allows the projects to go ahead. Now, is the industry making lots of profits? I think that's debatable. If you look at the losses in the supply chain, it's been some really, really tough years. And if you look at the margins and the share prices of some of the developers who are just doing renewables, they've also had tough years. So I think to describe it as, it's easy business, which is easy to make money, is really misplaced.
Mm-hmm. There's also a fact, obviously, in the US, we saw offshore wind, there's been challenges, and also carbon capture elsewhere. There's not Norway, there's been challenges getting off the ground. Are you optimistic, Roz, that we'll actually be seeing these burgeoning carbon capture and storage projects in line with the government's estimates? Or, much like many energy projects the government commits to, the dates can be quite flexible when it comes to actually when they're visible to us all?
Yeah, I am not a specialist on CCS engineering, but I share your concern that most large projects in the UK do seem to take longer than expected. So I hope that, as I say, I really hope that doesn't happen, because I think we need to know if this works, and if not, find some other things to do instead. Yeah, well, sure. I think that's...
One more thing on the CCS before I get to the questions is, are you surprised at the lack of sort of government announcements in recent months since the Track 1 and Track 2 shortlistings? And does that any sort of concern for you, again, on the process of delay, on being slow, and the fact there's an election coming up, which gives a wonderful excuse to push things back? Is that any sort of issue for you in terms of making decisions, Equinor?
So I think the reason it's been quiet is since the Track 1 announcements and the budget announcement back in the spring, those companies involved with the first Track projects are essentially negotiating with the government to get to a final investment decision on both sides. So that it's bound to be quiet now. This autumn, this September, is absolutely crucial. So do these projects get going or not? We'll know yes or no.
Sure. Radio silence a concern for you, Roz, or not so much?
No, I still think it's good that we actually move forwards with something when we've said we're going to do it. I think I do have a bit of a concern about the subsidy models, these so-called business models, which sounds much nicer than subsidy. There's kind of a proliferation of them now across various different bits, and it's very hard, actually, for anyone else to scrutinise them. Very hard to know what's going on, whether they're good value for money. And I think this is another reason I'm really keen to move to kind of market-based approaches. What I'm concerned about is they might end up skewing the choices that sectors use. So, for instance, industrial electrification could be a really good opportunity for more sectors, actually. We're seeing industrial heat pumps become viable solutions and kind of able to provide greater heat and things like the chemical sector. But there's no kind of subsidy, and the electricity prices are relatively high for industry in this country compared with other countries. Meanwhile, we've kind of got a CCS business model that offers a short-term capex loan as well as kind of long-term revenue certainty. And we've got similar with hydrogen. There's a kind of green and blue hydrogen equivalents, really. And I think that there's a real danger that we end up kind of encouraging people to go down the route that isn't the right route. I mean, we've got this far, so I guess hard to do a complete about turn, but I think what we would want to be looking at is kind of getting more things in the ETS, thinking about carbon contracts for difference more generally, some other kind of models that don't risk that kind of distortion.
Yeah. Sure. And if you go back to the early days of offshore wind, I think there was the same debate definitely with Treasury. Is it worth what was at the time very expensive prices to get the projects going? And it almost didn't get going, but it did. And we look back now and thinking it was good to have that government subsidy support to start with, kick it off, and then eventually it works and is much more commercial.
Sure. And on to questions with the iPad with Slido. And the most popular one of the day is on the question of lobbying. And the question is, I'll start with Roz, is how do you view the lobbying efforts by the fossil fuel industry, such as their push projects like Rosebank, to delaying progress towards these, I'm guessing net zero, targets?
Again, it's quite hard to judge because we're not in the rooms. Certainly as a kind of think tank and NGO, the government listens to us, but we don't get that kind of access that oil and gas companies get. And there are groups that, in the past there's been hydrogen kind of councils and things, which there's no NGO or civil society representatives on. And I think that's really problematic. So I definitely would like to see kind of full transparency about the conversations. I think that really is important. And the kind of, the imbalance, there is an imbalance of power in some of these conversations, and that I think there needs to be ways to bring in kind of more voices and make sure that the directions we're heading down and the use of public money is kind of the right approach.
On on this question of lobbying, what are your thoughts on this? Because obviously people point to lobbying as a sort of like potentially like nefarious activity, but do you see like lobbying as just dialogue between your companies and government? Do you think lobbying is a harm to net zero? I mean, Equinor are in principle in favour of net zero. Do you find that your lobbying efforts are undermining your own target?
So firstly, I would don't undersell what your organisation manages to do, because you have fantastic access and influence with politicians. And secondly, Equinor is a state-owned Norwegian company. So we are owned by the Norwegian people. And the energy industry is one of those industries which is very, very highly regulated, so such as telecoms or defence or what have you. And in all of those industries, neither government nor business can do it by themselves. So you have to have a dialogue between the two to make sure that you can work together to achieve your joint goals. And I don't think that's lobbying. I think you see both the Labour Party and the government here in the UK saying they want to work in partnership with business to get stuff done. In CCUS, the government wants to invest its money so that industry invests its money to create an industry of the future. That's what conversations are about, nothing more.
Sure. You'd push back on the idea that, say, Equinor had like unhealthy access or too much access to government for a democratic process to work around things like net zero?
I don't think we do have unhealthy access. I think we have, we're the largest supplier of energy to the UK. We supply a third of the gas. Of course, we should have access with them. The most phone calls that I would get from the government are if they hear that there is a fire in a refinery in Norway, because certainly is there an impact on UK's supply of energy? Those are reasonable.
Sure. Was on this issue of like geographic dependency, I suppose, on Norway, do you think CCS and the North Sea generally, do you think there is a risk of being too dependent on the North Sea for our energy needs and that being continued through CCUS?
We already are very dependent on the whole world, well, a range of countries around the world for our oil and gas. So I don't think North Sea is going to provide our oil and gas, even with the best of intentions. So.
It's quite a fiery Slido with the questions, so I must have to be careful with how I phrase things, while also avoiding getting eggs by any protesters. Another question's come in, which is address the elephant in the fact that Labour didn't come to this panel. Is there any concern that the shift of government could lead to a shift in the agenda? And we sort of touched on it earlier when we talked about whether CCS would have continuity, but is there any concern Equinor has around this potential instability from that change?
So the Labour Party has put out some very ambitious green transition plans, and we think those are great, frankly. We're kind of Norwegian and slightly dull. Sometimes, but what we like a business is you covered this before, is predictability and stability and long term. So the UK, to be its credit, has been great on this for the last 20 odd years with a pretty ambitious net zero leadership. We don't like that being politicized. So seeing that a future government, if Labour are successful, that they want to be ambitious on that, we're all power to their elbow, and we will want to be part of that with them.
Sure, and a question for Roz. Oh, just slid away a second there. When it comes to CCUS, if it's not the solution for many of the things that we talked about earlier, like cement and steel, I know you said you were supportive for cement, for example. Do you think there's a risk that maybe you're downplaying the extent at which it could be supportive of various industries, heavy industry, that we're particularly caring about now?
Yeah, well, if it proves the best solution, I think what I'm worried about is that we'll skew the market with business models that kind of provide support in some areas and not in others, and we can't then see what the best solution is. Certainly, if you look at what the CCC was predicting in its advice to the sixth carbon budget, there's quite a lot of CCS in there to support industry. I suppose my question is actually, at that point, we perhaps didn't know as much about electrification as we do now. So I would feel like electrification would nibble some of those sort of uses, nibble away at some of those uses. But electrification does have some issues too, which need to be solved, for instance, about delays to the grid. So which solutions are the best and most efficient, and what speed can we roll them out? There's quite a lot of kind of calculations that need to be made, and it'll probably be made on a site-by-site basis. I think there is going to be a situation where we're used to kind of one or two solutions per industry, combined heat and power plants in a swathe of industries, for instance, and perhaps we're moving to a situation where, and in domestic heating too, perhaps, where you might get sort of a mixture of different types of solution. In domestic heating, you might get kind of low temperature heat networks, etc., and some heat pumps, and we might sort of start to see a diversity in industry as well. So I think it's a kind of interesting but quite exciting kind of question, is actually what is the right solution in each sector.
Sure. Do you expect many sort of Green Alliance esteemed reporting anytime soon? Some further publications, some further things we disseminate to our readers at MECUC, Morning Energy Climate UK, about where to go for CCS and where to go for cement, heavy steel, those sort of things?
Well, yeah, we have several bits of work on steel that we've done already. I can tell you more about those if you're interested. And chemicals, I think the way that the crackers, which is the big, very high temperature heat bit, I think they are looking at CCS, and perhaps in the short term that is the best solution for various technical reasons. But actually there's an awful lot in this chemicals industry of medium and low temperature heat that could be addressed for electrification, and that's part of my concern there. And yeah, we'll keep looking at other sectors. We're gradually working our way down the kind of list based on emissions impact. But Green Alliance puts out lots of reports. This is it's our bread and butter.
And when it comes to the question of looking ahead with CCS, do you anticipate that there be further projects Equinor could announce alongside the ones they've already done? Would you see commitments for further projects in CCS in the UK?
So we have our own targets as a company for CCUS globally.
Yeah.
So we have projects in the UK, we have projects in the US, we have projects in Norway, and we have projects in continental Europe. And to the point about UK's role in this, we think the UK has been ahead in the last few years. It's slipped back in the last couple, but we think if they get stuff away this autumn, it will put them back up towards the top of the pack again. But as Ross said, CCUS is not the only answer for the energy transition, but it has a small niche role to play within it, and we will be part of that in the countries where we're operating, I'm sure.
Sure. Are there any things that you haven't touched on today that you want to get across from Equinor's position, in particular? I was thinking about, because I realised that there's a lot of pressure on oil and gas companies, and I think some of it's understandable. And I was wondering if there's any sort of message that you're trying to convey that we can all leave with when we exit this event and go off into the evening.
Yes. So beers are waiting, which is great. So I think as a sort of final point, before doing this job, I was living in Sweden, and the most famous Swede is the activist Greta Thunberg. And she has changed the world and focus on climate change. But she also says, if you can't get to 1.5, get to 1.6. And if you can't get to 1.6, get to 1.7. Every point of a bit helps. And I know you started the session at 2, and it felt slightly despondent about, are we going to make it? Can we make these targets? But actually, the more we can do, the better. Setting out ambitious targets gets you further. And I think companies like mine want to be part of that solution. And we're trying, not denying, as they say.
Sure. And the last word to you was on today's panel. Any further final parting thoughts?
I suppose one thing we haven't really talked about is the public conversation. I mean, CCS doesn't get much mention. Maybe that's fine. Maybe it can quietly happen with engagement in the local communities. But I think there are some important questions here, as we've discussed, about kind of how much we pay and who pays and over what time scale, and kind of which technologies we might want to use more generally. And I think it's a shame that there hasn't been more of an effort to have those conversations at times. And I think to also persuade to kind of get the demand point I mentioned up front as well on people's agenda more. We have a choice. We could actually use less energy, and then we won't need so much of these kind of technologies. And I think sometimes that politicians are scared of having those conversations, but if we could get to the point that we're talking about these things a bit more, that would be really helpful.
So Equinor quoting Greta Thunberg and you talking about lean to fly less. Nice final messages. Okay, thanks guys. I think that's basically everything from us today and this afternoon. Thank you once again to my 2 esteemed panelists. I believe there's, I need to introduce Kate Day back to the stage, political deputy editor, and we'll skedaddle.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, and I promise not to keep you from the drinks for very long. I hope lots of you will stick around. We'd love to see you all downstairs and join us for for more conversations. What a great session. I feel like we've covered an awful lot of ground. Everybody seems pretty agreed that the big targets are looking tricky, I would say. And even the government minister accepted that even 2035 is probably quite a challenge. So lots for us to think about. We've heard that the government's flagship subsidy scheme could be increased. We've heard a bit from Equinor about what they would make of a prospective Labour government, should there be one. Lots about NIMBY challenges, which I think has come up a lot in our coverage over the last year too. So keen to hear all of your thoughts on all of those, and a big thank you from me. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you so much.